Solaris gasped in pain as she dragged her mangled reptilian leg across the rocky cave floor, green blood oozing from the blaster wound, snarling as she realized the human soldier crouching across from her would be her only hope for survival on this hellish jungle planet. "Listen up, recruits, because this might just save your lives someday," Paul Foster growled, his grizzled face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "When I was just a young private, no older than any of you, my ship was shot down by those scaly Ithorian bastards during the fiercest space battle I'd ever seen. I found myself stranded and alone on some godforsaken alien world, with no way to contact my fleet. The place was crawling with Ithorian patrols, armed to the teeth with advanced weapons tech. They thought they were hot shit, conquering any race they saw as beneath them, which was pretty much everyone." Paul took a swig from his flask before continuing. "I knew I was royally screwed, injured with few supplies, hunted by merciless killers on their own turf. As I limped my way through that dense alien jungle, I figured it was only a matter of time before an Ithorian patrol found me and ended my lucky streak. By some miracle, I stumbled on a hidden cave and ducked inside just before I passed out. And that's when I saw her, an Ithorian soldier, just as badly wounded as I was. We both froze, torn between attacking each other or keeping quiet so we didn't draw any patrols sniffing around. I'll never forget the pure hate in her eyes as they locked with mine, both of us bleeding out, barely able to move, but still ready to rip the other's throat out. The irony was, I had to use the same survival skills I learned to kill Ithorians just to avoid getting spotted by them now. But neither of us could risk making a sound, so we just stared each other down, two enemies forced together, both too stubborn to die. Paul shook his head as he stared into the fire. We were trapped in that cave for days, licking our wounds, watching each other like hawks. I kept thinking how easy it would have been to just finish her off, Ithorian scum that she was, but something kept staying my hand. Maybe it was the pitiful shape we were both in, or maybe deep down I was just grateful not to be alone on that nightmare of a planet. Funny how being stuck in hell with someone can change the way you look at them. Leaning back, Paul looked each young recruit in the eye, his voice deadly serious. That Ithorian and I, we needed each other to survive, whether we liked it or not. And let me tell you, there's nothing more dangerous than needing your sworn enemy just to live another day, because you never know when they might put a knife in your back, or worse, when you might start to see them as more than just a lizard or human, but as a living, breathing being, not so different from yourself. And that's a mighty perilous line to walk. Paul takes another long pull from his flask, grimacing at the memories. Over the next few days, Solaris and I had no choice but to rely on each other. It was either that or get picked off one by one out there. We split the pitiful rations and dirty water we managed to scrounge up, always watching each other's six when we dared to venture out of our bolt hole. I had the survival training to find edible plants, and she knew how to track prey we could actually take down. Hated to admit it, but we made a pretty good team. He rubs a hand across his stubbled jaw. One night, this huge beast, all teeth and claws and bad attitude, came sniffing around our cave. Solaris spotted it first, hissing a warning. We went back to back without even thinking, blasters and knives out, ready to fight for our lives. It lunged right for us, jaws snapping. I fired off a volley of plasma bolts while Solaris slashed at its hide with her blade. Felt like we danced that deadly tango for hours, weaving around each other, covering blind spots, slowly wearing it down until finally it slumped over dead, both of us painted in its blood. Solaris grinned at me, and damned if I didn't grin right back. Felt good, fighting alongside her like that. Like maybe I'd been wrong about the Ithorians, or at least this one. Paul's expression turned somber. We started opening up to each other after that, much as we could with the language barrier, learned her story through scattered words and crude drawings scrawled in the dirt. She'd been snatched up as a hatchling, shoved into the war machine, never known anything else. My own history spilled out too. Dead parents, running with gangs, enlisting to get off the streets. We were both born to this life, molded by it, two sides of the same coin. He sighs deeply, the firelight dancing in his haunted eyes. Started to let my guard down, thinking maybe there was a real bond growing there, fragile and unlikely as it was. But I got careless. Ithorians must have tracked us somehow, because one morning all hell broke loose. Plasma grenades shook the cave, blinding light, ringing ears. Lost sight of Solaris in the chaos. Staggered out into the open, choking on the smoke, praying she'd made it out. And then I saw her, limp and unmoving, being dragged away by her own kind. Felt like a fist around my heart, squeezing tight. Paul's voice cracks, the pain still raw. I couldn't get to her, not with their heavy artillery pinning me down. Had to run, escape deeper into that godforsaken jungle, telling myself she was a soldier, that she'd find a way to survive, that I'd find her again. But I knew it was a pretty lie. She was a traitor to them now, and the Ithorians didn't suffer traitors. All I could do was swear that I'd tear that shithole planet apart until I found her, dead or alive. Because she deserved that much. She deserved a hell of a lot more. Paul continues his story. I trekked through that dense alien jungle for days, machete in hand, hacking through the undergrowth. Every step was treacherous. Strange plants that would burn your skin, quicksand that could swallow you whole, predators lurking in the shadows. But I didn't care. All I could think about was finding Solaris, getting her back. I used every survival trick they taught us in basic training, tracked the Ithorian patrol movements, followed their trampled paths, stayed downwind so they couldn't catch my scent. Came too close for comfort a few times. I still remember diving into a stagnant swamp, covering myself head to toe in this rancid muck, gagging on it, just as a patrol marched by. But it worked. Their keen noses never even twitched in my direction. Paul shakes his head, a grim smile playing on his lips. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted their encampment. Dozens of those scaly bastards, all heavily armed, high-tech defenses everywhere. And at the center, I caught a glimpse of Solaris, chained up like an animal, her scales matted with blood. I wanted to charge in there, guns blazing, but I knew I'd be dead before I took 2 steps. So I waited, watched their patrols, learned their routines. When night fell, I made my move. He leans forward, voice dropping to a near whisper. I crept through the shadows, blending in, invisible. Their tech might have been advanced, but it was no match for good old-fashioned human ingenuity. I slipped past their sentries, disabled their alarms. It was almost too easy. When I found Solaris's cell, I took out the guards before they could even reach for their weapons. She looked up at me, eyes widening, and then she smiled. A real smile, full of hope and fire. I shot off her chains, pulled her to her feet, and that's when all hell broke loose. Paul's face darkens, his grip tightening on his flask. Alarms blaring, spotlights sweeping, plasma bolts filling the air. We were surrounded in seconds, outnumbered and outgunned. But Solaris, even half dead on her feet, she just grinned at me and said, "What took you so long?" We fought like demons, back to back, taking down Ithorians left and right, but it wasn't enough. They just kept coming, an endless tide of scales and teeth and hatred. I knew we were going to die there, in the mud and the blood, light years from home. He pauses, eyes distant, lost in the memory. And then, just when I thought it was over, the sky lit up like the 4th of July, laser cannons, plasma missiles, the whole shebang. It was my squad in a dropship, raining holy hell down on those Ithorian bastards. Never been so glad to see a Stinger-class ship in my life. They blasted a path right through to us, lowered the ramp, and hauled us aboard. Felt like a miracle, snatched from the jaws of death. Paul's voice softens, a hint of wonder creeping in. We limped to the medbay, more dead than alive, holding each other up. The medics patched us up, pumped us full of painkillers and stims. And Solaris, she just looked at me, her hand gripping mine, and I saw something in her eyes I never thought I'd see from an Ithorian. Respect, gratitude, maybe even a flicker of something more. I knew then that whatever this was between us, this bond forged in blood and fire, it was just the beginning. Paul's voice grew somber as he continued his tale. As soon as we docked on the Valkyrie, the flagship of the human fleet, Solaris and I were rushed to the medbay. The doctors patched us up quick, slapping on synth skin and pumping us full of nano-regeneratives. But there was no time to rest. We were summoned to the bridge immediately for debriefing. The grizzled veteran shook his head. I could see the skepticism on the faces of the top brass as they eyed Solaris. An Ithorian defector was unprecedented. They grilled her hard, demanding every scrap of intel she had. The language barrier was a bitch, but Solaris managed to get her point across. She had vital information about an imminent attack on Novaria, a major human colony world. Paul's eyes flashed with conviction. I stood up and vouched for her, putting my own reputation on the line. I told them about the warrior I'd fought beside, the bond we'd forged through blood and fire. It was a risk, but I believed in her. And to my surprise they listened. The fleet changed course, jumping to light speed to reach Novaria before the Ithorians could strike. He allowed himself a small smile. During the journey, Solaris and I spent every waking moment together. I taught her English, word by painstaking word. In return, she shared her knowledge of Ithorian tactics, the chinks in their armor. We pored over holomaps, plotting out potential battlegrounds, and in the quiet moments between something deeper grew. Paul's voice softened, his eyes distant. One night Solaris turned to me and spoke her true name, Zalia. It rolled off her tongue like a prayer, a secret shared. In her culture, names had power. To know one's true name was a sign of utmost trust, and in that moment I knew I would die for her if I had to. Her. His expression hardened as he continued, but we had no time for sentiment. As we dropped out of hyperspace near Novaria, all hell broke loose. The Ithorians had set a trap, an armada lying in wait. They outnumbered us 3-1, their ships bristling with advanced weaponry. It was a slaughter. Paul gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Our ships were being torn apart, the screams of the dying filling the comms. In that moment, I knew we had only one chance. Solaris and I volunteered to lead a desperate mission, infiltrate the Ithorian flagship and take out their command center. It was a suicide run, but it was our only hope. He let out a harsh laugh. The brass agreed, probably figuring we were dead either way. They gave us a squad of the toughest bastards in the fleet, the kind of soldiers who eat nails for breakfast. Using Solaris's inside knowledge, we managed to slip past their defenses in a cloaked shuttle, latching onto the flagship's hull like a tick. Paul's voice grew hard as steel. We cut our way in, blasters blazing. It was a bloody slog, fighting deck by deck. The Ithorians threw everything they had at us. Elite guards, battle drones, even some kind of genetically engineered abominations. But we pushed forward, inch by bloody inch. He paused, his eyes haunted. When we finally reached the bridge, I saw him, the Ithorian commander, the one who'd enslaved Solaris, who'd butchered entire worlds. He was a monster, a ruthless warlord feared across the galaxy, and he was waiting for us. Paul's voice trembled with barely suppressed rage. The battle was fierce, brutal. We lost good soldiers, their bodies littering the deck. But Solaris, she fought like a demon, a whirlwind of claws and blades. She and the commander clashed in a duel that shook the very ship, their blood mingling on the deck plates. He closed his eyes, reliving the moment. In the end, it was Solaris who struck the killing blow. She drove her blade through the commander's black heart, her eyes burning with righteous fury. As he fell, the Ithorian fleet fell with him, their resolve crumbling. Paul's voice grew somber as he described the aftermath of the great battle. With both sides bloodied and bruised, a tentative truce was called. The human and Ithorian fleets limped back to their respective corners to lick their wounds and bury their dead. It was an uneasy peace, fragile as spun glass, but it held. For a time. He shifted in his seat, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. During that brief respite, Solaris and I found ourselves drawn together like two stars caught in each other's gravity. We'd been through hell and back, seen the best and worst of each other, and somehow against all odds we'd forged a bond that went deeper than mere camaraderie. I remember one night as we sat in the observation deck watching the stars drift by, Solaris turned to me with this look in her eyes, a mix of fear, doubt, and something else I couldn't quite name. She told me she felt lost, adrift, like she no longer knew her place in the universe. By turning against her own kind, she'd become an outcast, a traitor to her people. Paul's voice softened, his eyes distant. I took her hand in mine, looked her straight in the eye, and told her she wasn't alone, that she had a place by my side, always, that I'd stand with her against whatever the galaxy threw our way. The smile she gave me then, it was like watching a sunrise. He sighed, the weight of memory heavy on his shoulders. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. Just as something real started to blossom between us, just as we dared to hope for a future beyond the endless cycle of war, that's when everything went to hell. Paul's face hardened, his fists clenching. It was a rogue Ithorian faction, led by some fanatical warlord who saw Solaris as the ultimate traitor to their species. They caught us with our guard down, our ship still under repair. It was a slaughter. They tore through our defenses like they were made of paper, their weapons cutting through hull and bone alike. In the chaos of the battle, I lost sight of Solaris. One moment she was by my side, blaster in hand, scaly face set with grim determination. The next, she was gone, vanished into the maelstrom of fire and blood. I screamed her name until my throat was raw, but there was no answer. Paul's voice trembled with barely suppressed rage. It wasn't until the smoke cleared that I learned the truth. Those rogue bastards had taken her, dragged her off to some secret base on a backwater planet. To make an example of her, the warlord said, to show the galaxy what happened to those who betrayed the Ithorian way. He slammed his fist on the table, eyes blazing. I didn't hesitate. I gathered what remained of my squad along with a handful of Ithorian defectors who saw Solaris as a hero, and we set out to bring her back, no matter the cost. Paul's voice took on a haunted quality as he described the journey to that nameless planet. It was a hellscape, a wasteland of jagged rocks and howling storms that seemed to go on forever. We had to fight for every inch of ground, dodging patrols and fending off creatures that looked like they'd crawled straight out of a nightmare. But I pushed forward, driven by a single all-consuming thought. Solaris needed me, and I'd be damned if I let her down. He leaned forward, eyes intense. When we finally reached the base, it was like something out of a fever dream. A fortress of black metal and pulsing energy, bristling with gun emplacements and crawling with fanatics. They outnumbered us 20-1. Easy. Paul allowed himself a grim smile. But they made a mistake. They underestimated what a human will do for someone they love. I led my team in a series of hit-and-run attacks, striking hard and fast, then melting back into the shadows. We sowed chaos and confusion, drawing out their defenses, forcing them to spread themselves thin, and when they were at their most vulnerable, that's when we struck. Paul's voice grew tight with tension. I fought my way into the heart of the base, carving a path of blood and fire. Every step was a battle, every corridor a kill zone. But I didn't stop, didn't falter, because I knew Solaris was waiting for me. He closed his eyes, the memory still raw. When I reached the holding cells, my heart nearly stopped. They were empty, no sign of Solaris. For a moment I thought I'd failed her, that I'd been too late. Paul's voice dropped to a whisper. But then I heard it, the roar of the crowd, the crackle of energy weapons, and I knew where she was. The warlord had taken her to the central chamber for a public execution. He looked up, his eyes hard as flint. He wanted to make an example of her, but he didn't know what he'd unleashed, because there's nothing in this universe more dangerous than a human with nothing left to lose. Paul's eyes flash with cold fury as he bursts into the central chamber, blaster drawn. His heart stops as he sees Solaris bound and beaten, the warlord's cruel blade poised at her throat. In that frozen moment their eyes meet, defiance and desperation, a silent plea and a wordless promise. He doesn't hesitate. With a roar, Paul launches himself at the warlord, tackling the massive Ithorian to the ground. They grapple across the floor, a tangle of fists and claws and sheer primal rage. Paul feels the alien's raw strength, each blow rattling his bones, but he fights with the ferocity of a man possessed. Through the chaos he sees Solaris straining against her bonds, scales slick with blood as she twists and writhes. He has to reach her, has to give her a chance. Paul maneuvers the brawl closer, desperately trying to put himself between Solaris and the warlord's vicious swipes. But the Ithorian is too powerful. A massive fist cracks against Paul's skull, stars exploding across his vision. The warlord pins him down, crushing the air from his lungs, scaly claws wrapped around his throat. As darkness clouds the edges of his sight, Paul scrabbles weakly at the iron grip, his struggles fading. Suddenly the pressure vanishes. Paul gasps, choking, blinking away the haze. Solaris stands over him, a bloody shard of metal clutched in her hand, her eyes alight with righteous fury. She hauled the warlord off him, and now they circle each other, predator and prey. Together they converge on the Ithorian like twin storms, a whirlwind of blades and fists and raw, unfettered rage. The warlord is a juggernaut, his hide thick with scars, but even he can't stand against their combined onslaught. Solaris darts and weaves, her makeshift knife finding the chinks in his armor, while Paul hammers at him with relentless piston-like blows. In the end, it's Paul who strikes the final blow. His fist crunches into the warlord's jaw with a sickening crack, sending the Ithorian reeling back. The alien's eyes widen in shock as he stumbles, his heel catching on the edge of a churning pit of machinery. For a moment he teeters there, arms windmilling, and then he's gone, swallowed by the grinding gears and hissing pistons. Silence falls, broken only by their ragged breathing. Paul and Solaris stare at each other across the blood-slick floor, chests heaving, adrenaline still singing in their veins. And then they're in each other's arms, lips crashing together in a desperate, searing kiss. But there's no time to savor the moment. Alarms are blaring, the base shuddering with distant explosions. Hand in hand, they fight their way through the chaos, blasters flaring, cutting down any Ithorian foolish enough to stand in their way. They burst into the hangar bay, diving into the nearest shuttle, just as a plasma bolt sizzles past their heads. Paul's hands fly across the unfamiliar controls as Solaris guns the engines. The shuttle roars to life, smashing through the hangar doors in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. They punch through the atmosphere, the planet's surface falling away beneath them, enemy ships hot on their tail. Solaris mans the guns, her aim true, blasting their pursuers out of the sky one by one. And then they're in the clear, the inky void of space embracing them, the rogue base receding to a distant speck behind them. Paul slumps back in his seat, his body one giant ache, his mind reeling. It's over. They're alive. She tells him then of the warlord's final plan, overheard in snatches during her captivity. A doomsday weapon, a planet killer, the rogue faction's revenge against all who wronged them. With the warlord's death, his second will surely accelerate its creation, his fury unbound. Paul feels a chill settle in his gut. They're the only ones who know, the only ones who can stop it. But they're fugitives now, hunted by both sides in this brutal war. They have no allies, no resources, nowhere to turn. Solaris meets his gaze, her eyes fierce with determination. We have to stop them, Paul, no matter the cost. He nods slowly, his mind racing. It's an impossible mission, a suicide run, but what choice do they have? He reaches for the controls, plotting a course for the one place they might find help. A remote, lawless space station, a den of smugglers and mercenaries and rogues. As the stars blur into streaks of light, Paul reaches for Solaris's hand, gripping it tight. They're in this together, come what may. The fate of the galaxy rests on their shoulders. And somewhere out there a doomsday clock is ticking. As Solaris and I docked at the seedy space station, Paul continued, we knew we were walking into the lion's den. This place was a notorious hive of scum and villainy, crawling with the dregs of the universe. But it was also our best shot at finding intel on the Ithorian doomsday weapon. He chuckled darkly. We had to blend in, so we posed as just another pair of rough-and-tumble mercenaries, looking for a quick score. I traded my uniform for battered armor, Solaris her scales for a hooded cloak. We moved through the grimy corridors like shadows, our eyes and ears open for any scrap of information. Paul shook his head. It was a delicate dance, navigating that underworld. One wrong move, one lingering glance, and we'd have a bounty hunter on our tail, or a blaster to our heads. There were close calls, too. I remember one scarred Venaxian who got a little too curious about my partner. I had to introduce his face to the bar before he got the message. He leaned forward, voice dropping. Finally, we caught a break. Overheard a group of drunken Ithorian deserters bragging about a job they'd scored, guarding some hush-hush facility on a nearby moon. Said the pay was astronomical, that whatever was being built there would change the face of the war. Paul's eyes hardened. Solaris and I, we knew it had to be the weapon. We tailed those loose-lipped bastards back to their ship, slipped aboard just as the airlock was cycling closed. It was a tense ride, let me tell you. We were stowaways on a ship full of trained killers, one wrong breath away from discovery. Paul's voice grew tight. As we approached the moon, Solaris and I were ready to make our move, to jump ship and infiltrate the base on our own terms, but we never got the chance. One of those Ithorian bastards stumbled across our hiding spot, sounded the alarm. He closed his eyes, the memory still raw. It was chaos, plasma bolts flying, alarms screeching. In the confusion, Solaris and I got separated. I had to make a split-second call, and I ejected in an escape pod, praying to whatever gods might be listening that she'd found her own way out. Paul's fist clenched. I hit the moon's surface hard, pod half buried in the dirt, dragged myself out, battered and bleeding, my head ringing, and Solaris, there was no sign of her, no way to know if she'd made it out, or if those scaly bastards had recaptured her, or worse. Saint-Cyr. Paul's voice grew tense as he recounted the final, desperate battle against the Ithorians second-in-command. Solaris and I, we were pinned down, plasma blasts scorching the air above our heads. That bastard's cannon packed a hell of a punch, and our cover was disintegrating fast. We both knew we'd be dead meat if we didn't act quick. He leaned forward, eyes intense. I had a crazy idea, a real long shot. Told Solaris I'd draw the Ithorian's fire, give her a chance to circle round and catch him from behind. She didn't like it. I could see the fear in her eyes, but we were out of options. So with a deep breath and a prayer to whatever gods were listening, I charged out into the open, zigzagging like a madman. Paul's fist clenched as he relived the memory. Those cannon blasts, they were like miniature suns, searing the ground black wherever they hit. I could feel the heat singing my skin, the shock waves rattling my bones. But I didn't stop, didn't falter. I just kept running, taunting that scaly bastard, making myself the biggest target in the galaxy. He shook his head, a grim smile playing on his lips. It worked. The second-in-command, he was so focused on turning me into a smoking crater, he never saw Solaris coming. She pounced on him like a shadow cat, all claws and fury, wrestling for control of that cannon. It was a sight to behold, let me tell you, this slip of a female going toe-to-toe with a brute twice her size. Paul's voice swelled with pride. But that's the thing about Solaris. She's a fighter through and through. She ripped that cannon right out of the Ithorian's grip, swung it around, and vaporized him at point-blank range. 1 minute he was there, the next, nothing but ash on the wind. He sighed, the triumph fading from his eyes. We thought it was over then. Thought we'd limp to the hangar, steal a ship, and blast off this rock before the charges blew. But the universe had one last kick in the teeth for us. Just as we reached the hangar, alarms howling. An entire squad of Ithorian reinforcements stormed in, weapons hot and hungry for blood. Paul's voice grew heavy, weighed down by the memory. We were dead on our feet, bleeding and burnt and running on fumes. Didn't stand a chance against those odds. That's when Solaris turned to me, her eyes filled with a terrible resolve. Said one of us had to stay behind, buy the other time to escape, to warn the fleet. I argued, raged, pleaded, but deep down I knew she was right. He closed his eyes, pain etched into every line of his face. In the end, she convinced me. Said I was the only one the human leaders would listen to, the only one who could make them understand the threat we faced, and as much as it tore me apart, I knew my duty. Paul's voice cracked, the grief still raw. We held each other then, one last time, our lips meeting in a kiss that tasted of blood and desperation and unspoken goodbyes. And then I was running, stumbling up the ramp of the nearest ship, my vision blurred with tears. The last thing I saw as the airlock sealed was Solaris, my fierce warrior woman, turning to face the oncoming horde with fire in her eyes and a battle cry on her lips. He fell silent, his gaze distant, lost in the painful memory. I blasted out of that hangar like a bat out of hell, the ship shuddering as the charges detonated, the base collapsing in on itself behind me. And Solaris? She was down there, buried beneath a mountain of rubble, holding the line to the bitter end so I could escape, so I could save us all. Paul's voice hardened, a cold fury settling over him. I made it back to the fleet, told them everything. The Ithorians, they were horrified, sickened by what their rogue faction had done. They pledged to hunt down any remnants, stamp out that poison at its source, and the humans, they hailed me as a hero, gave me medals, titles, all the pomp and circumstance, but it meant nothing, not without her. He leaned back, his voice growing soft, almost reverent. Solaris, she gave her life for mine, for all of us, and I'll carry that with me until my dying day. That beautiful, fierce, alien woman who taught me the true meaning of courage, of love, of what it means to be human. Paul fell silent, his tale drawing to a close, the weight of memory heavy on his shoulders. The recruits sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide, their hearts heavy with the sacrifice of a woman they'd never known, but who had changed the course of history with her bravery. Paul's voice trembles as he continues his tale, the pain of loss still raw in his words. I pushed that Ithorian ship to its breaking point, redlining the engines, not caring if I burned them out. All that mattered was getting the warning out, letting the fleet know what they were up against. He closes his eyes, reliving the desperate race against time. I could see the explosions reflected in the cockpit glass as the base went up behind me, feel the shockwaves rattling my teeth. But I didn't look back, just kept broadcasting on every frequency, praying someone would hear me. The grizzled veteran lets out a shaky breath. By some miracle they did. The human fleet, the Ithorian council, they all listened, scrambled their forces to hunt down the rest of those rogue bastards before they could regroup and strike again. It was a hell of a thing to see, all those ships mobilizing as one. Gave me a glimmer of hope even through the grief. Paul shakes his head, a bitter smile on his lips. They called me a hero, offered me a promotion, a chance to lead the joint task force, but I turned it down. How could I think about accolades when Solaris was still down there, her fate unknown? No, I had to go back, had to find her, or at least bring her body home. Paul's voice cracks, the emotion raw and powerful. I was ready to give up, to accept that she was gone, but then I saw it. A faint heat signature on my scanner buried deep beneath the debris. It was Solaris, somehow still clinging to life in a reinforced bunker. I've never dug so fast in my life, never felt my heart pound like that. Tears glisten in his eyes as he recounts the moment. When I finally reached her, pulled her from the wreckage, I thought it was a miracle. But then I saw the extent of her injuries, the way her scales were charred and cracked, the labored rise and fall of her chest. I knew she wouldn't make the journey back. Paul's voice drops to a whisper, each word heavy with grief. I held her in my arms as she slipped away, trying to comfort her, to ease her pain. She looked up at me with those fierce, beautiful eyes, and with her last breath, she whispered that she loved me, begged me to find peace, to live for more than just the fight. He wipes away a stray tear, his gaze distant. I buried her there on that lonely moon, built a cairn of stones to mark her grave, a warrior's rest, and as I stood there, saying my final farewell, I made a vow, to honor her memory, to dedicate my life to bringing our peoples together, because only in understanding, in cooperation, could we hope to build a better future. Paul falls silent, the weight of his tale heavy in the air. The recruits sit in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of his loss, the depth of his sacrifice. A long moment passes before he speaks again, his voice rough with emotion. And that, recruits, is the story of Solaris, the bravest soul I ever knew, the love I found in the midst of war. Her legacy lives on, in the fragile peace we've built, in the bonds we've forged across the stars. But the fight continues, the struggle to hold on to that peace, to keep her dream alive, and that's where you come in. He looks at each recruit in turn, his gaze fierce with purpose. You're the next generation, the ones who will carry on this mission. It won't be easy, and the cost will be high. But always remember what we're fighting for. Not just survival, not just victory, but a future where no one else has to make the sacrifices that Solaris and I did. A future worth living for. As the old veteran falls silent, his tale at an end, the recruits sit in contemplative silence, each grappling with the weight of his words. Paul turns to gaze out the viewport, his eyes fixed on the distant stars, a ghost of a smile on his weathered face. In their twinkling light he sees the reflection of a fierce-scaled warrior, her spirit forever guiding him, forever inspiring him to fight for a better tomorrow. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.